The compound was burning. Kira Ashford crouched behind a collapsed concrete pillar, her M4A1 soapy mod carbine pressed against her shoulder, the weight as familiar as her own heartbeat. Smoke filled her lungs with every breath. The acrid smell of burning diesel fuel mixed with cordite and something worse, something she tried not to think about. 14 civilians huddled in the room behind her. 6 children, 8 adults, Afghan interpreters and their families. People who trusted America enough to risk everything, and now America had sent one woman to save them. The radio crackled against her ear. Ashford, were pinned down. IED collapsed the primary breach. We can't get to you. Recommend abort and extract solo. She didn't respond immediately. Through the shattered window ahead, she counted movement. Taliban fighters, at least a dozen visible, probably twice that many she couldn't see. The intelligence brief had said 15 to 20 hostiles, light weapons, minimal fortifications. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Negative, she said into the radio, her voice steady despite her heart hammering at 140 beats per minute. 14 civilians inside. I'm not leaving them. Ashford, that's a direct order to... She switched off the radio. Behind her, a child whimpered. 6 years old, maybe 7. Dark eyes wide with terror, watching Kira with an expression that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Not hope, not trust, just raw, primal fear of the violence she represented. Kira checked her ammunition. 7 magazines, 30 rounds each. 210 rounds total. She did the math automatically the way she'd been trained. 52 hostiles, if her count was accurate. 4 rounds per target would be conservative. She'd need to make every shot count. Stay down, she said to the civilians in broken Dari. I'm getting you out. The 6-year-old girl nodded, still staring. Kira moved to the window, controlled her breathing, and began the work she'd been trained to do. The work she was exceptional at. The work that would eventually break something fundamental inside her. The first target dropped at 400 meters. Controlled pair center mass. The second fell 3 seconds later. Then the third, the fourth. Her world narrowed to breath control, trigger squeeze, sight picture. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The rifle became an extension of her nervous system. No thought, just execution. 18 minutes later, it was over. 52 Taliban fighters lay dead. 14 civilians were alive. The compound was rigged to explode, and Kira carried an 8-year-old boy through the flames as the building collapsed behind her. The explosion destroyed $14 million in communications equipment her team had been securing. 3 of her teammates caught shrapnel from the blast. All survived, but 2 would spend months in recovery. The last thing Kira saw before the medics sedated her was that 6-year-old girl's face, watching her with eyes that had witnessed things no child should ever see. They gave her the Medal of Honor paperwork and the psychiatric discharge paperwork in the same envelope. She chose to disappear. 93 days later, Kira Ashford stood at attention in the morning formation at Crimson Ridge Military Academy, trying desperately to remember how to be weak. The Pacific Ocean crashed against black rocks 300 feet below the eastern perimeter, a constant soundtrack of violence that most recruits had learned to ignore. Kira never ignored it. The sound triggered memories of water hoses washing blood off concrete, of waves of Taliban fighters surging forward, of tides she couldn't stop. 587 personnel stood in perfect rows on the main parade ground. The morning fog rolled in from the ocean, turning the formation into something ghostly and uncertain. Kira stood in the back row of Alpha Company, right where she belonged, where the weakest recruits always stood. At ease, Colonel Brennan Thatcher called from the reviewing stand, his voice carrying across the concrete expanse. Kira shifted her weight, relaxed her posture by exactly the regulation amount, and focused on the middle distance. The performance had to be perfect. Not too rigid, not too casual. Just another struggling recruit trying to get through another day. Master Sergeant Thaddeus Rourke stood off to the side with the other senior NCOs, his eyes scanning the formation with the practiced assessment of a man who'd spent 40 years evaluating soldiers. Kira felt his gaze pause on her for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He knew. She wasn't sure exactly what he knew or how he knew it, but Rourke had been watching her since day 3. Not with suspicion exactly, more like recognition. The way a wolf might recognize another wolf pretending to be a dog. The formation briefing droned on. Training schedules, equipment, maintenance, upcoming evaluations. Kira let the words wash over her while maintaining the slightly vacant expression she'd perfected over the past 93 days. The expression of someone struggling to keep up someone who didn't quite belong here. It was the hardest performance of her life. In Kos province, she'd killed 52 men in 18 minutes without breaking a sweat. Here at Crimson Ridge, she struggled to look incompetent for 93 days without breaking character. The second task was proving infinitely more difficult than the first. When the formation finally dismissed, Kira filed toward the mess hall with the other recruits. She deliberately positioned herself in the middle of the crowd, not leading, never lagging too far behind. Just another face in the mass of uniforms. "Hey, Ashford." She turned. Private Garrett Hayes jogged up beside her, his young face earnest and encouraging. 24 years old, fresh from infantry training, still believed the military was about brotherhood and honor. Kira envied him that innocence. "You okay?" Hayes asked. "You looked kind of out of it during formation." "Just tired," Kira said, keeping her voice soft and certain. "Didn't sleep well." "Nightmares again?" She nodded. That part wasn't an act. The nightmares were real. The 6-year-old girl's face, the smell of burning flesh, the mathematical precision of 52 kills in 18 minutes. Her subconscious replayed Coast Province every night with perfect accuracy. "You'll get through it," Hayes said with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced real combat. "You're improving every day. I saw your marksmanship scores from yesterday. You hit the target 8 times. 8 hits out of 40 rounds at 50 meters. For a Ranger-qualified operator who could put rounds through a playing card at 800 meters, it had taken immense concentration to miss that badly. The secret wasn't in pulling shots. It was in missing with mathematical consistency, making each failure look natural rather than deliberate." "Thanks," Kira said, managing a small smile. "I'm trying." She was trying to forget how to do the things she'd once done with lethal perfection. Trying to become ordinary, unremarkable, invisible. Trying to bury Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford of Task Force Sentinel under the persona of Private Kira Ashford, the Academy's most struggling recruit. After breakfast, she had weapons training. The Armory issued her an M4 carbine identical to the one she'd carried through 24 combat operations. She held it with deliberate awkwardness, fumbling with the magazine release taking too long to chamber around. The range instructor, a patient sergeant with 20 years of service, walked her through the basics. Firm grip private, stock tight against your shoulder. Breathe steady, squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it. Kira nodded, positioned herself, and proceeded to miss the target by exactly 2 inches left with every shot. Not random misses, controlled failures, the hardest shooting she'd ever done. From the observation tower, Master Sergeant Rourke watched through binoculars. He lowered them slowly after her 5th shot, his weathered face thoughtful. That evening, after the day's training ended, Rourke found her cleaning her rifle in the armory. The other recruits had already left. Kira sensed his presence before he spoke, the way predators sense each other, but she forced herself not to react. "You're Frank Ashford's daughter." It wasn't a question. Kira's hands stilled on the cleaning rod for just a fraction of a second before continuing their motion. "Yes, Sergeant." Rourke moved closer, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. "I trained your father at Fort Bragg in '98. Good man, great operator. Taught him the finer points of close quarters combat before he shipped out for his first deployment." Kira kept her eyes on her rifle. "He spoke highly of you, Sergeant. You move like him, even when you're pretending not to know how to move." The words hung in the air between them. Kira considered her options. Deny, deflect, admit. Each choice carried consequences. "I don't know what you mean, Sergeant." Rourke pulled up a stool and sat down heavily. 62 years old, 40 years of service, too many deployments to count. Grenada in '83 Panama, in '89 Gulf War, and in '91 Somalia, in '93 Iraq and Afghanistan for over a decade. The kind of soldier who'd seen everything and survived by understanding what he was seeing. "I've trained operators for 40 years, he said quietly. "I know what suppressed reflexes look like. I know what it means when someone misses targets with mathematical consistency. I know what it means when someone controls their breathing a little too perfectly during stress drills." Kira set down the cleaning rod and met his eyes. "What do you want, Sergeant?" "I want to know what you're hiding from." She almost told him. The Coast Province mission, the 52 kills the children's faces the way she'd felt nothing during those 18 minutes except cold tactical precision. The way that absence of feeling had terrified her more than the violence itself. Instead, she said, "Just trying to get through each day, Sergeant." Rourke studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Frank's daughter deserves space to heal. I don't know what happened to you, and I don't need to know. But I recognize the look. You're not hiding from an enemy. You're hiding from yourself." Kira felt something crack in her chest just slightly. This man understood. He saw her. "I reported concerns about the Inspector General coming tomorrow," Rourke continued. "General Vincent Blackwood, four-star old-school disciplinarian, has a reputation for breaking recruits he considers weak. I told the chain of command he needed oversight. They told me to stand down." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to be careful. Blackwood looks at struggling recruits the way a hunter looks at wounded prey. And you, Private Ashford, are pretending to be the most wounded prey in this entire academy." Kira felt her stomach tighten. "I can handle myself, Sergeant." "I know you can. That's what worries me. If he pushes you hard enough, you might stop hiding. And something tells me the world isn't ready to see what you're hiding." Rourke stood, his joints creaking. "Whatever you need, kid, I've got your back. Your father was like a brother to me. That makes you family. And family looks out for each other." He left before Kira could respond. She sat alone in the armory for another hour, staring at her rifle, thinking about Coast Province, about the 6-year-old girl named Amara, who'd watched her kill a man with her bare hands, about the way violence had come so easily, so naturally, like breathing. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Day 93. Still don't recognize the woman in the mirror. The woman who killed 52 men in 18 minutes is someone I'm trying to bury. But she's there just under the surface, waiting. I came to Crimson Ridge to learn how to be weak, to prove to myself that I'm more than a weapon. 93 days, and I'm still not sure I've succeeded. The nightmares haven't stopped. The flashbacks haven't stopped. All I've learned is how to hide better, how to make people believe I'm something I'm not. Maybe that's its own kind of strength. Or maybe it's just another form of cowardice." She closed the journal and tried to sleep. The nightmares came like clockwork. General Vincent Blackwood arrived at Crimson Ridge Military Academy at 0530 hours on day 94, and the temperature of the entire base seemed to drop 10 degrees. His staff car rolled through the main gate with military precision, flanked by 2 escort vehicles carrying his aide and security detail. The morning fog still clung to the coastal facility, turning the sprawling complex into something isolated and removed from the ordinary world. Blackwood stepped out of the vehicle in his perfectly pressed uniform, 4 stars gleaming on his collar, every ribbon and medal positioned with mathematical accuracy. At 54 years old, he stood 6 foot 3 inches tall, 238 pounds of conviction and authority. His gray hair was cut in a severe military fade that hadn't changed style in 30 years. His pale blue eyes swept across the academy grounds with the cold assessment of someone who'd spent his entire life evaluating people and finding most of them lacking. Colonel Thatcher met him at the administration building entrance, standing at attention with his command staff arranged behind him. "General Blackwood, welcome to Crimson Ridge Academy. We're honored to tell you." "Where's your worst performing recruit?" Blackwood interrupted. Thatcher blinked. "Sir, your weakest trainee, bottom 5%. I want to observe them first. If an institution is measured by its weakest links, I need to see what you're trying to polish into shape here." The colonel exchanged glances with his staff. "Sir, our training philosophy focuses on developing potential rather than simply—" "I didn't ask about your philosophy, Colonel. I asked about your weakest recruit." Thatcher pulled out a tablet, scrolled through performance metrics. "That would be Private First Class Kira Ashford. Physical fitness scores in the bottom 5%, marksmanship below standard combat simulations, show significant areas for improvement. This Private Ashford, is she getting better?" "Gradually, sir. She shows determination, positive attitude, continuous. Determination doesn't stop bullets, Colonel. Attitude doesn't win firefights." Blackwood took the tablet, studied Kira's file with the intensity of someone reading a tactical plan. "How did she make it through basic training with these scores?" "Different standards, sir. Basic training is about establishing baseline capabilities. We're about developing elite." "She represents institutional failure." Blackwood handed back the tablet. I want to observe her during today's training exercises. If Crimson Ridge is producing soldiers like this, we need to have serious conversations about your continued operation. The words carried weight. Congressional hearings about Afghanistan withdrawal failures had put elite training facilities under microscope. Budget cuts were threatened. Oversight committees were questioning whether specialized academies like Crimson Ridge justified their costs. Blackwood's inspection could shut them down. Colonel Thatcher swallowed his objections and nodded. Of course, General. Private Ashford will be participating in urban warfare simulations this afternoon. Blackwood smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Excellent. Let's see what your development philosophy produces. He didn't tell the colonel about his son, about Lieutenant Marcus Blackwood, killed in Helmand Province 4 years earlier when an IED destroyed his vehicle during a routine patrol. Didn't mention how the after-action report had cited operational errors, how Blackwood had convinced himself those errors stemmed from lowered standards, from diversity quotas, from letting people serve who shouldn't. Marcus had died with a female soldier on his team, a soldier who, according to reports, had hesitated under fire. Blackwood had spent 4 years channeling his grief into a crusade against what he saw as the degradation of military excellence. When he looked at struggling recruits like Private Ashford, he didn't see a person. He saw the weakness that had killed his son. The morning formation went smoothly, but Blackwood's presence turned the routine into something tense and pressurized. He stood at the front with Thatcher, his gaze sweeping across the 587 assembled personnel like a weapon system acquiring targets. Kira stood in her usual position in the back row, maintaining the slightly uncertain posture she'd perfected. But even from 50 meters away, she felt Blackwood's attention settle on her. Not suspicion exactly, something colder. Assessment and dismissal happening simultaneously. She was nothing to him, a data point representing failure. After formation dismissed, Blackwood requested Kira's training schedule. He planned his entire day around observing her. Physical training at 0700, weapons maintenance at 0900, tactical briefing at 10:30, urban warfare simulation at 1400 hours. The physical training was deliberately brutal. 5-mile run along the coastal road, elevation changes that could break ankles, wind coming off the Pacific that felt like frozen knives. Kira finished last, as she always did, arriving 6 minutes behind the lead group. Blackwood watched from a vehicle that paced the run. He made notes in a leather portfolio. The weapons maintenance session showed Kira fumbling with basic tasks that any competent soldier should handle reflexively. Disassembling her rifle took twice as long as it should. Reassembly required instructor assistance. The other recruits helped her without being asked, the way units naturally assist struggling members. Blackwood saw accommodation where he should have seen failure. More notes in the portfolio. The tactical briefing was worse. The instructor laid out a building clearance scenario, and Kira asked questions that seemed to miss obvious tactical considerations. She confused hand signals. She requested clarification on basic radio protocols. She appeared confused by concepts she should have mastered in basic training. Blackwood's expression grew progressively darker throughout the briefing. At lunch, he pulled Colonel Thatcher aside. "How is that recruit still here?" "Sir, as I mentioned, our philosophy." "Your philosophy is creating a liability that will get people killed in real combat. She's 17 weeks into training and still can't complete a 5-mile run without finishing last. She can't field strip her rifle without help. She doesn't understand basic tactical concepts. What exactly are you developing here?" Thatcher struggled for a response. "Some soldiers are late bloomers, General. With proper support and support," Blackwood's voice rose slightly. "In real combat, who's going to support her when she freezes under fire? Who's going to help her reload her rifle when she's taking contact the enemy?" Several nearby personnel turned at his tone. Thatcher glanced around, uncomfortable with the public nature of the conversation. "We can discuss this in private, sir. I want to see her in the urban warfare simulation this afternoon. If she performs at the level suggested by these scores, I'm recommending immediate review of your academy's entire training program." The urban warfare facility occupied 5 acres of the academy grounds. Shipping containers and plywood structures created a mock city that could be reconfigured to simulate different environments. Narrow streets, tall buildings, blind corners. Every element designed to test tactical decision-making under stress. Kira was assigned to a 6-person squad with a simple objective: Clear out a building extract. A simulated hostage avoids simulated casualties. Paintball weapons added consequence to mistakes. General Blackwood positioned himself in an observation tower that provided a clear view of the entire exercise. He lifted binoculars as the squad moved out. From the ground level, Master Sergeant Rourke watched both the exercise and the general. He tried to warn Kira that morning, but training schedules had kept them separated. Now all he could do was watch and hope she maintained her performance. The squad moved through the mock city with reasonable competence. 4 of the 6 members demonstrated proper tactical awareness. They used hand signals, effectively cleared corners, with appropriate caution covered each other's movements. Kira struggled visibly throughout. She was slow to respond to hand signals, requiring the squad leader to repeat commands. When crossing open ground under simulated fire, she hesitated, earning a paintball hit to the shoulder that would have been a casualty in real combat. During the building clearance phase, she appeared confused about room entry procedures, forcing her team to adjust their approach. The squad failed to complete the mission within the allocated time. Post-exercise analysis indicated that Kira's positioning errors had contributed to 2 simulated casualties. Through his binoculars, Blackwood watched every mistake with growing fury. This wasn't just poor performance. This was someone who would get her entire team killed in real operations. He lowered the binoculars slowly, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Colonel Thatcher stood beside him, clearly uncomfortable. "That," Blackwood said quietly, "is exactly what I'm here to fix." What neither of them saw was what happened after the exercise officially ended. The squad regrouped at the extraction point, removing safety equipment and conducting after-action review. Kira drifted away slightly, checking her gear, appearing to be alone. She wasn't alone. Security camera 3 had an angle on her position. For exactly 17 seconds, when Kira thought no one was watching, she moved differently. She cleared the entire floor of a 3-story structure with textbook precision, moving from room to room with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Her weapon handling was perfect. Her movement was controlled. Her tactical awareness was sharp and deadly. Then she glanced up, saw the camera angle, and immediately reverted to her uncertain, fumbling persona. In the Academy security office, the technician monitoring camera 3 sat forward in his chair. "What the hell?" He replayed the footage 3 times, then flagged it for Master Sergeant Rourke's review. Rourke watched it alone that evening in his office. Watched Kira transform from struggling recruit to elite operator and back again in the span of 20 seconds. He'd suspected, but seeing the proof still sent chills down his spine. This wasn't someone learning to be competent. This was someone working desperately to appear incompetent. The question was why, and the more pressing question was whether she could maintain the act under Blackwood's increasing scrutiny. He had a terrible feeling he was about to find out. Day 95 began with another formation at 0600 hours. The transport from the barracks had broken down, causing 3 recruits, including Kira, to arrive 30 seconds late. 30 seconds. In a normal week, it would have warranted mild correction. Maybe extra duty, nothing severe. But General Vincent Blackwood was not in the mood for mercy. 587 personnel stood at attention on the parade ground when Kira and 2 others jogged to their positions, out of breath from running the quarter-mile from the disabled transport. They fell into formation as quietly as possible, hoping their arrival had gone unnoticed. It had not. "Those 3, Blackwood's voice cut across the morning air like a blade. "Front and center, now." Kira felt her stomach drop. She moved forward with the other 2 late arrivals, maintaining her uncertain posture, keeping her breathing elevated from the run. All 3 came to attention, facing the general. Blackwood stepped down from the reviewing stand and approached them with the deliberate pace of someone who knew all eyes were on him. He stopped directly in front of Kira. "Name?" "Private First Class Kira Ashford, sir." "Of course it is." He turned to address the entire formation, his voice pitched to carry across the parade ground. "I want everyone here to understand something fundamental about military service. Punctuality in combat means the difference between life and death. If you can't manage basic time discipline during training, you will fail when it matters." He turned back to Kira. "You're 30 seconds late. In real operations, 30 seconds is an eternity. 30 seconds is how long it takes for an ambush to kill your entire squad. 30 seconds is how long it takes for a mission to fail catastrophically." Kira kept her eyes focused above, and to the right of his shoulder proper military bearing, but she could feel 587 pairs of eyes on her. Your repeated failures, Blackwood continued, his voice rising, endanger every soldier who might depend on you. Your inability to meet basic standards reflects poorly not just on yourself, but on this entire institution that continues to accommodate your inadequacy. The words landed like physical blows. Some of the assembled personnel shifted uncomfortably. This had moved beyond correction into something more personal and cruel. I question how you passed basic training, Blackwood said, his face inches from hers now. I question why you're here. I question what possible value you bring to the United States military. Kira maintained her bearing, but inside something was stirring. Something she'd spent 95 days trying to keep buried. The part of her that had cleared buildings in Coast Province, that had calculated 52 kills with mathematical precision, that had survived through controlled violence. Stay down, she told herself. Stay weak. This is temporary. He's just words. But the words kept coming. You're a disgrace to everyone who earned this uniform through actual competence and sacrifice. You're a liability. You're exactly what's wrong with modern military standards. Across the formation, Master Sergeant Rourke tensed. He'd seen this before. Watched Blackwood break recruits with public humiliation, always targeting those he deemed weakest. Usually his victims crumbled, requested transfers, sometimes left the military entirely. But Kira wasn't a weak recruit. She was an operator pretending to be weak. And Rourke could see the micro-expressions flickering across her face, the tiny movements of someone fighting not to react. After 10 minutes, Blackwood finally dismissed them back to formation. Kira returned to her position, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists behind her back. The rest of the day was a blur of training exercises, all conducted under Blackwood's withering observation. At every opportunity, he found ways to highlight her failures, to make examples of her mistakes, to demonstrate what he saw as institutional incompetence. By evening, Kira was running on pure discipline. The performance was cracking. 95 days of careful character work was eroding under sustained pressure. She needed space, needed to decompress, needed to remember why she was doing this. Instead, she got the mess hall incident. At 1800 hours, the dining facility filled with hungry soldiers. 347 personnel crowded the space, conversations echoing off concrete walls and metal tables. The smell of institutional food mixed with diesel fuel from the motor pool next door triggering flashbacks. Kira pushed down through force of will. She took her usual position at an isolated table, sitting alone as she had for 95 days. Mechanical eating mind, elsewhere trying to process the day's accumulated stress. She reached for napkins, her hands not quite steady from exhaustion. The orange juice glass tipped over. It happened in slow motion. The glass tumbled, liquid arcing through the air, splashing across the metal table and dripping onto concrete floor. Such a minor accident. The kind of thing that happened dozens of times daily in military dining facilities. But timing is everything. 3 tables away, General Vincent Blackwood had chosen to dine with enlisted personnel rather than in the officers' facility. He wanted to observe natural behavior, see how discipline held when soldiers thought they weren't being watched by someone who could end careers. He saw the orange juice spill, saw Kira Ashford, his symbol of institutional failure, making yet another mess. Something in his mind shifted. This wasn't about correction anymore. This was about power, about dominance, about punishing weakness until it either got strong or got gone. Conversations died table by table as people noticed his expression, as they saw him stand slowly, deliberately, as they watched him begin walking toward Kira's table. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the growing silence. Kira was focused on cleaning the spill-gathering napkins, wiping down the table. She hadn't noticed yet, hadn't felt the predator approaching. Private Garrett Hayes started to stand from his table, instinct telling him to help. Master Sergeant Rourke, seated with senior NCOs near the entrance, shook his head in a tiny, almost invisible gesture. Don't draw attention. Don't make this worse. 20 feet away. 15. 10. Rourke was moving now, trying to intercept, but he was too far away, and Blackwood was too focused. 5 feet. Stand up, Private. Kira's hands stilled on the napkins. She recognized that voice, recognized the tone, the cold authority of someone who'd decided to make an example. She set down the cleaning supplies and came to attention, her posture correct, but not rigid. Eyes focused above and to the right of his shoulder. Military bearing maintained despite the exhaustion, despite the stress, despite the 95 days of performance art that was rapidly approaching its breaking point. 347 witnesses held their breath. General Vincent Blackwood looked at Private Kira Ashford and saw everything he hated about the modern military. Saw weakness, saw accommodation, saw the lowered standards he believed had killed his son. You can't even eat breakfast without making a mess. His voice carried throughout the silent facility, every syllable designed for maximum humiliation. How do you expect to function in combat? How do you expect to protect the soldiers beside you when you can't even handle a glass of juice? Kira remained silent. Proper military response. Let the superior officer speak. Accept the correction. Move on. But Blackwood wasn't finished. He stepped closer using his height advantage, 6'3" towering over her 5'7". Invasion of personal space that crossed from professional correction into something more aggressive. You're a disgrace to this uniform. You're a liability to everyone around you. You represent everything wrong with this institution's failure to maintain standards. Master Sergeant Rourke was 15 feet away now, close enough to see Kira's jaw muscle twitch, close enough to recognize the warning signs. She was about to break character. And when she did, everything would change. Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Blackwood commanded. Kira's eyes shifted from the middle distance to his face. Direct eye contact. And for just a moment, Blackwood saw something in those eyes that didn't match the struggling recruit he thought he was addressing. Something cold, something calculating, something dangerous. Then it was gone, replaced by the uncertain expression he expected. But he'd seen it, and it enraged him. The idea that she might be anything other than genuinely weak, that she might be hiding competence rather than lacking it, felt like mockery, like she was laughing at him. His hand came up, not thinking, not planning, just reacting to 4 years of grief and rage and conviction that weakness had killed his son, and weakness needed to be purged from the military with fire and violence if necessary. His open palm arced toward her face. Master Sergeant Rourke, 12 feet away, saw it happening and knew he couldn't stop it. Could only watch as 30 years of military protocol shattered. Private Garrett Hayes, recording on his phone in violation of facility policy, but following pure instinct, captured every frame. 347 witnesses would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. The slap connected with a sound like a rifle shot. Sharp, clean, echoing off concrete walls. The impact snapped Kira's head to the right, left an immediate red handprint across her pale cheek. And for exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. Kira's head returned to its original position with mechanical precision. Her eyes refocused on General Blackwood's face. And every bit of performance art, every carefully maintained moment of appearing weak, every second of the 95-day charade evaporated like morning fog burning away under harsh sunlight. Her pupils dilated. Her breathing shifted from controlled military rhythm to something more primal and efficient. Her weight redistributed from heels to balls of feet. Muscle memory suppressed for 95 days came flooding back with the force of released pressure. Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford, Task Force Sentinel Operator 47 combat missions, 52 confirmed kills in her last engagement, stood where Private Kira Ashford had been pretending to exist. She spoke 5 words in a voice that was calm, level, and carrying clearly to every corner of the silent mess hall. Sir, you just made a mistake. The words hung in the air like a chemical reaction suspended in the moment before explosion. 5 syllables that somehow managed to convey both perfect military respect and an unmistakable warning that the fundamental nature of reality had just shifted. Not a threat, not insubordination, simply a statement of objective fact delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that made everyone who heard it understand that something irreversible had just occurred. General Vincent Blackwood's face flushed crimson. His pale blue eyes widened with a mixture of shock and rage that suggested he couldn't quite process what had just happened. In 31 years of military service, across 2 wars and countless training facilities, no enlisted personnel had ever responded to his discipline with anything approaching challenge or defiance. The idea that this struggling recruit, this symbol of institutional failure, would dare suggest that he had made any kind of error was so far outside his experience that he seemed momentarily paralyzed by the audacity. "What did you just say to me?" His voice rose to a pitch that bordered on shouting. His body language shifted into something that was no longer professional military bearing, but personal confrontation. The posture of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of witnesses and who was prepared to use whatever force necessary to reestablish dominance. Kira didn't respond immediately. She was conducting the kind of threat assessment that 4 years with Task Force Sentinel had made automatic. Height, weight, stance, breathing pattern, muscle tension, eye movement. Every data point processing through combat-trained neural pathways that had been deliberately suppressed for 95 days. Target profile, 6'3", 238 pounds. Age 54, reduced reaction time, probable joint stiffness from decades of military service, evident in his movement patterns. Combat experience, Gulf War 33 years ago. No indicators of recent physical engagement training based on his stance width and guard positioning. Threat level, high intent, low capability. Master Sergeant Rourke stood 12 feet away, frozen in mid-step. He recognized what was happening with the clarity of 40 years observing combat-ready personnel. He saw Kira's stance shift, saw the way her breathing changed, saw the predator emerge from underneath the prey disguise. "Oh God," he said quietly to himself. "He doesn't know what he just activated." Private Garrett Hayes, positioned at a table 20 feet away, held his phone steady with hands that were starting to shake. The camera captured everything. The general's aggressive posture, Kira's transformation. The 347 witnesses frozen in collective shock. Blackwood took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Kira to less than 2 feet. His superior height and bulk created physical intimidation that had ended countless confrontations throughout his career. His right hand clenched into a fist. His shoulders squared for additional physical action. His entire posture broadcasting the message that this interaction would end with total submission or total destruction. "Private Ashford," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent dining facility. "You will stand down immediately, or I will have you arrested for insubordination and assault on a superior officer. You will apologize for your inappropriate response to legitimate military discipline, and you will accept additional corrective action without further commentary." But Kira had stopped listening to his words. She was reading his body language with the kind of tactical analysis that came from years of life-or-death combat experience. She could see the tension in his shoulders indicating preparation for another strike. She could read the positioning of his feet that showed he was planning to use his height and weight advantage to physically overwhelm her. She could detect the slight tremor in his hands that revealed adrenaline levels consistent with someone preparing for violence. Most importantly, she could see that he had fundamentally misunderstood what was happening and was about to escalate a situation that was already beyond his ability to control. "General," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried a tone that wasn't military protocol, but something older and more dangerous. "You have approximately 2 seconds to step back and reconsider your next action, because what happens after that will be your responsibility, not mine." The warning was delivered with the same calm certainty as her previous statements, but now everyone in the mess hall could hear the difference. This wasn't a trainee speaking to a superior officer anymore. This was one predator acknowledging another's presence while making it clear that territory had been claimed and boundaries had been established. Blackwood's response was exactly what she expected. His left hand reached for her shoulder while his right hand drew back for another strike. His movements were telegraphed by decades of relying on physical intimidation rather than actual combat training. His technique was adequate for disciplining subordinates who couldn't resist, but catastrophically inadequate for engaging someone who had spent years learning to neutralize threats that were faster, stronger, and better armed than an aging general whose primary weapon was institutional authority. Kira's response took exactly 5 seconds from the moment his hand began to move until the moment he hit the floor. But those 5 seconds contained more technical precision, controlled violence, and career-ending consequences than most military personnel would witness in their entire service careers. Second one belonged to biomechanics and recognition. Blackwood's left hand moved toward Kira's shoulder in a grabbing motion that started from his hip, telegraphed and obvious. His right hand drew back simultaneously, preparing for a closed fist strike that would do significantly more damage than the open palm slap. Kira's response began before his hand made contact. Her weight shifted to her left foot while her torso rotated clockwise in a movement so smooth and economical that it looked almost like a natural adjustment of posture rather than the beginning of a devastating counterattack. The rotation took his reaching hand past her shoulder without contact, throwing his balance slightly forward as his momentum carried him into empty space where her body had been a fraction of a second earlier. From across the room, Master Sergeant Rourke recognized the opening stance. Filipino Kali, probably taught by someone in the Dog Brothers lineage based on the angle of deflection. The kind of martial art that turned an opponent's aggression into their own defeat. Hayes's phone camera captured it from a side angle. Frame by frame, you could see the exact moment Blackwood realized his hand had encountered nothing but air. The confusion in his expression. The forward momentum that committed him to a trajectory he could no longer control. Second two was pure physics applied through years of training. As Blackwood's body weight shifted forward, Kira's right hand came up in a tight arc that intercepted his extended left wrist. But instead of blocking or deflecting his movement, she guided it, used his own forward momentum to pull him further off balance while stepping into his now exposed center line. Her grip on his wrist was precise. Thumb positioned on the radial nerve cluster at the lateral aspect of his wrist, fingers wrapped around to press on the median nerve on the medial side. 15 to 20 pounds of pressure applied to both nerve clusters simultaneously caused involuntary muscle weakness in his hand and forearm. The medical accuracy was textbook. Radial nerve compression affected his thumb and index finger grip strength. Median nerve compression affected his remaining fingers. The combined effect meant his hand opened involuntarily, losing all capacity for striking or grasping. Simultaneously, Kira's left hand moved to his right elbow as it came forward in his planned second strike. Instead of opposing the force directly, she redirected it. Classic Kali principle, don't fight force with force, guide energy into positions where it defeats itself. She applied leverage to his elbow joint, hyperextending it by approximately 15 degrees. Uncomfortable, but not injurious. The angle locked his right arm against his own torso, trapping it in a position where it couldn't generate any striking force. Both of Blackwood's arms were now controlled, neutralized, using his own momentum and body weight against him. The leverage advantage meant Kira's 142 pounds were controlling his 238 pounds through biomechanics rather than strength. Colonel Brennan Thatcher had entered the mess hall 30 seconds earlier, drawn by reports of a disturbance. He stood at the entrance, taking in the scene. 347 personnel frozen in their seats. A four-star general with his arms trapped by a private first class who moved with a precision that absolutely did not match her personnel file. Jesus Christ, Thatcher said quietly. Second three demonstrated why Task Force Sentinel had recruited Kira from conventional special operations. With Blackwood's arms controlled and his balance compromised, Kira executed a hip throw that was textbook perfect in its application of leverage and timing. She rotated her hips underneath his center of gravity while maintaining control of his trapped arms, using his own body weight as the primary force in the takedown. But this wasn't a training exercise where the goal was to demonstrate technique without causing injury. This was a threat neutralization in a non-combat environment requiring immediate resolution with appropriate force. Kira's application of the throw was designed to end the confrontation decisively. Instead of guiding Blackwood to the ground in a controlled manner, she accelerated his descent, added her own strength to his falling weight to ensure maximum impact with the concrete floor, while still maintaining the joint locks that prevented him from breaking his fall safely. The rotation was perfect, hip position precisely under his center mass, weight transfer smooth and efficient, arms controlled throughout to prevent any defensive response. 47 combat missions and hundreds of hours of training compressed into one flawless execution of technique. Security Camera 3 captured it from an overhead angle. The footage would later be analyzed frame by frame by military investigators who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. The precision, the control, the complete absence of wasted movement. This wasn't anger or panic or self-defense improvisation. This was professional operator-level technique executed with the kind of muscle memory that only came from thousands of repetitions under stress conditions. Second four was the sound that everyone in the mess hall would remember for the rest of their military careers. Blackwood's body hit the polished concrete floor with a wet thud that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence. 238 pounds of human flesh meeting an unforgiving surface at speed. The impact resonated through the floor, through the metal tables, through the bodies of 347 witnesses. But more disturbing was the secondary sound that followed immediately afterward, a strangled gasp that began as an attempt to shout and ended as a desperate struggle to breathe. The sound of all the air being forced from his lungs by the impact combined with the realization that he was completely helpless. Kira had maintained control of his left arm throughout the throw. As his body impacted the floor, she transitioned smoothly from the wrist control to a shoulder lock. Her hand moved from his wrist to his upper arm, applying leverage that hyperextended his shoulder joint, while simultaneously twisting it into a position where any resistance would result in dislocation or worse. Her right knee came down against the side of his neck, not on his trachea, which would have crushed his windpipe and killed him, on the carotid artery, applying precisely controlled pressure that restricted blood flow to his brain. The technique was clinical in its precision. A blood choke, not an air choke. 11 to 13 pounds of pressure applied at the correct angle to the carotid artery, enough to restrict blood flow by approximately 70%, not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to create the sensation of suffocation and impending unconsciousness. At this pressure level, Blackwood had 7 to 10 seconds before he would lose consciousness, 4 to 6 minutes after that before brain damage would occur. Kira was counting silently, her internal clock tracking the duration with the same mathematical precision she'd used to count ammunition in Coast Province. 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. Her breathing was slightly elevated but controlled. Heart rate approximately 95 beats per minute, elevated from her baseline of 58, but nowhere near panic levels. Her expression was calm, professional, showing no anger or satisfaction. This was a technical problem being solved with the appropriate tools. The position made it clear that permanent injury or death were readily available options that she was deliberately choosing not to exercise. She could increase pressure and render him unconscious in 3 more seconds, could shift her knee position slightly and crush his trachea, could apply more leverage to the shoulder and dislocate the joint. She did none of these things, just maintained exactly the pressure necessary to establish complete control while monitoring his response. Blackwood's experience of these moments was entirely different. He couldn't breathe properly. His vision was tunneling dark edges, closing in from the periphery. His face was changing color, shifting from red exertion to purple hypoxia. His free right hand was trapped under his own body weight, useless. For the first time in 31 years of military service, General Vincent Blackwood understood what it felt like to be completely, utterly helpless, to have your life in someone else's hands, to know with absolute certainty that you were seconds away from unconsciousness or death, and the only thing preventing it was the restraint of the person you just assaulted. Terror flooded his system, pure, primal animal fear. Second 5 was capitulation and the complete reversal of power. Blackwood's right hand, the only limb he could move, began slapping frantically against the concrete floor. 3 rapid strikes in the universal signal of submission. Tap, tap, tap. The same gesture used in training dojos around the world to indicate, "I yield you when, please stop." Please, he gasped the word, barely audible through his compressed carotid artery and restricted airway. Please, can't breathe. The tone was pure terror, pleading, begging, a complete inversion of the commanding general who'd been asserting dominance 5 seconds earlier. 4 stars meant nothing when you were on the ground struggling for oxygen. Rank provided no protection when someone who knew exactly what they were doing had you in a position where consciousness was measured in seconds. 347 witnesses watched a 4-star general beg a private first class for mercy. Kira released immediately. The joint lock on his shoulder released first, then the pressure on his neck, both done simultaneously in a smooth motion that spoke to training and discipline. She didn't hesitate, didn't apply extra pressure for revenge, didn't continue the hold a moment longer than necessary. The instant he submitted, she stopped. She stepped back 3 feet and returned to the position of attention. Arms at her sides, posture correct, eyes forward. Waiting for instructions, available for questions. Professional and controlled despite what had just occurred. Her breathing was returning to baseline, heart rate dropping back toward normal. The slight flush in her cheeks from exertion was already fading. No trembling in her hands, no emotional response visible on her face. This had been a technical problem, solved with appropriate force, nothing more. Medical assistance requested for General Blackwood, she announced clearly, her voice carrying throughout the silent mess hall. Appears to have fallen and sustained minor injuries. The clinical professionalism of the statement, delivered while standing over the body of a four-star general who was still struggling to breathe normally, somehow made what had just happened even more shocking than the violence itself. Blackwood collapsed completely onto the concrete, no longer even attempting to maintain dignity. Gasping and shaking as blood flow returned to his brain and oxygen filled his lungs. His uniform was disheveled jacket, twisted shirt, untucked name tag askew. His hair, usually maintained in that severe military fade with perfect precision, was mussed and disordered. But worse than the physical disarray was his face. Tear tracks from pain and terror. Sweat soaking through his collar. Expression showing shock, humiliation, confusion, fear. The complete psychological destruction of someone who'd built an entire identity around dominance and control, now reduced to helpless victim in front of an audience of hundreds. The contrast burned itself into memory. Blackwood on the ground, defeated, crying, vulnerable. Kira standing at attention, uniform, perfect, composed, professional. Victim and operator. Weakness and strength. The image that would define this moment for everyone who witnessed it. Master Sergeant Rourke moved forward slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of concern and something that might have been pride. He'd seen combat for 40 years across 6 conflicts. He'd witnessed violence in every form, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. In 40 years, he said quietly to Colonel Thatcher, who'd moved up beside him, I've never seen violence that controlled. She could have killed him 6 different ways in those 5 seconds. She chose the one method that left him alive, conscious, and able to learn a lesson. Thatcher was already reaching for his radio, calling for medical response and military police. His mind was racing through protocols, regulations, consequences. A private had just physically dominated a general officer. Self-defense or not, justified or not, this was going to explode through the chain of command like a tactical nuclear weapon. Get everyone's name, he ordered the senior NCO nearest him. All 347 personnel present. Nobody leaves until we have statements. Confiscate all phones. This facility is locked down, effective immediately. But even as he gave the orders, Thatcher knew it was futile. Hayes had been recording. Others probably had been too. In the age of smartphones and social media, nothing stayed contained. By tomorrow, this footage would be viral across military networks. By next week, it would be on civilian news. The question wasn't whether this incident would become public. The question was how much damage it would do before the truth came out about who Private Kira Ashford really was. The base medical team arrived within 90 seconds, their response time reflecting the kind of emergency readiness that Crimson Ridge maintained for training accidents and combat injuries. Staff Sergeant Sienna Vale led the team, a 14-year combat medic who'd seen everything from gunshot wounds to IED trauma. What she found was a 4-star general sitting against a table leg, conscious and breathing normally with no obvious external injuries beyond bruising that was already developing on his neck and shoulder. General Blackwood, I'm Staff Sergeant Vale. Can you tell me where you're experiencing pain or discomfort? Blackwood's response was barely coherent, mumbled phrases about his shoulder and neck that didn't provide much useful diagnostic information. His breathing was rapid and shallow, consistent with someone recovering from a panic response. His skin was clammy in a way that suggested his body was still processing stress hormones. Vale checked his vitals with practiced efficiency. Blood pressure, 155/98, elevated but not dangerous. Heart rate 118, high but dropping. Respiratory rate 24, hyperventilating, slightly. Pupils equal and reactive to light, no signs of head trauma. Sir, can you tell me what happened? Blackwood's gaze immediately shifted to Kira, who was still standing at attention 15 feet away. His expression showed fear, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of recognition, as if he was starting to understand that his assumptions about her capabilities had been catastrophically incorrect. She, there needs to be an investigation, he managed to say, his voice hoarse from the pressure that had been applied to his throat. Vale noted the injuries with clinical detachment, bruising consistent with joint manipulation and controlled pressure. No indication of excessive force or continued application after submission. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing and had exercised significant restraint. General, I need to do a full examination. Can you stand? Blackwood tried, failed on the first attempt, succeeded on the second with Vale's assistance. He stood unsteadily, refusing the stretcher that the medical team had brought. Some part of him was still trying to reclaim dignity, trying to walk out of this mess hall under his own power, rather than being carried out like a casualty. I need to speak with Colonel Thatcher immediately, he said, his voice gaining some strength. There needs to be a formal investigation. Charges need to be filed. This cannot stand. But even as he spoke, Blackwood seemed to realize that any investigation would necessarily involve explaining how a four-star general had ended up on the floor of a mess hall after a confrontation with a junior enlisted soldier who was officially considered one of the weakest trainees at the academy. The implications of that explanation would be difficult to manage, regardless of how the facts were presented. Vale and her team escorted Blackwood toward the exit. He limped slightly, whether from actual injury or psychological impact was unclear. He didn't look back at Kira, couldn't bring himself to acknowledge her presence. The woman who had just demonstrated that all his assumptions about weakness and strength were built on foundations of sand. As the medical team departed, Colonel Thatcher approached Kira. She remained at attention, waiting for official instructions. Private Ashford, I need you to provide a preliminary statement about the events that occurred here. This statement will be recorded and may be used in subsequent investigations. Do you understand? Yes, sir. In your own words, describe what happened. Kira's response was delivered in the precise factual language of someone with extensive experience providing testimony about violent encounters. No emotional language, no subjective interpretations, just clinical description of actions and responses. At approximately 18:15 hours, General Blackwood struck me across the face with an open hand during what appeared to be a disciplinary interaction regarding a spilled beverage. When he prepared to strike me again, with a closed fist, I defended myself using appropriate force to neutralize the threat. I applied joint manipulation techniques to control his arms, executed a hip throw to bring him to the ground, and applied a blood choke to restrict blood flow until he submitted. At no point did I use excessive force or continue defensive action after the threat was neutralized. Total engagement time was approximately 5 seconds. Thatcher made notes while she spoke, but his attention was focused as much on what wasn't being said as on the actual words. The complete absence of justification or explanation beyond basic facts. The use of terminology like neutralize the threat and blood choke and joint manipulation that suggested formal training and combat engagement protocols far beyond anything taught in basic training. And most tellingly, the overall demeanor of someone who considered physical confrontation to be a routine professional responsibility rather than a traumatic personal experience. Private, are you currently experiencing any injuries or medical concerns as a result of this incident? No, sir. I sustained no injuries during the encounter. Do you require any medical evaluation or psychological support services? No, sir. I am fit for duty and available for any additional responsibilities or assignments. The exchange was becoming increasingly surreal. The person who had apparently suffered the least trauma from the confrontation was the junior enlisted soldier who had just physically defeated a general officer in front of hundreds of witnesses. Thatcher concluded the preliminary interview and arranged for Kira to be escorted to secure quarters pending the arrival of investigators from higher headquarters. As military police led her away, still maintaining that perfect posture and professional bearing, Thatcher turned to find Master Sergeant Rourke standing nearby. You knew, Thatcher said. It wasn't a question. Rourke nodded slowly. Suspected, couldn't prove it. Didn't want to expose her before she was ready. Ready for what? To stop hiding from who she is, what she's capable of. Rourke watched Kira disappear through the mess hall exit, flanked by MPs who looked nervous despite the fact that she was cooperating completely. That wasn't a private defending herself, Colonel. That was an operator neutralizing a threat with textbook precision. Then who the hell is she really? That, Rourke said quietly, is a question that's going to require someone with a lot more clearance than either of us to answer. Within 6 hours of the incident, a priority message arrived at the Pentagon. Eyes-only classification routed directly to the Office of Military Intelligence. The message was brief incident at Crimson Ridge Academy involving Private First Class Kira Ashford. Video evidence suggests advanced combat training inconsistent with personnel file. Request immediate background investigation and deployment of investigator with appropriate clearance. Lieutenant Colonel Reed Callahan received the tasking at 0200 hours. He was 35 years old, military intelligence, with the kind of security clearance that allowed him to read files that most generals didn't know existed. He'd spent the last decade investigating everything from espionage to classified program security breaches. He pulled Kira's file from the JPAS database, the Joint Personnel Adjudication System, that tracked everyone with security clearances. What he found made him sit forward in his chair. The file had layers. The surface layer showed Private First Class Kira Ashford, mediocre performance metrics, unremarkable service record. But underneath that layer, visible only to someone with his clearance level, was another file entirely. Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford, 75th Ranger Regiment, Task Force Sentinel Attachment, classification level, top secret, sensitive compartmented information. Callahan opened the classified file and began reading. With each page, his understanding of what had happened at Crimson Ridge shifted from confusion to clarity to something approaching awe. Service record, 18 months Eastern Europe, embedded in underground fighting circuits for counter-trafficking operations. 6 months Southeast Asia training indigenous forces in counterinsurgency tactics. 47 combat missions across 3 theaters. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor 2 awards, Purple Heart 2 awards, and then the final entry, the one that explained everything. Coast Province, Afghanistan, February 14, 2024. Operation classified details redacted except for outcome summary. 52 enemy killed in action. 14 hostages recovered alive. $12 million equipment loss. 3 friendly casualties, non-fatal. Operator assessment exceeded mission parameters, chose civilian safety over asset preservation, demonstrated exceptional capability under extreme duress. Recommended for Medal of Honor. Simultaneously recommended for psychiatric discharge. Resolution operator reassigned to non-combat training. Role Crimson Ridge Academy, pending psychiatric clearance and administrative review. Callahan leaned back in his chair and watched the video footage that had been transmitted with the incident report. Watched Kira transform from struggling recruit to elite operator in 5 seconds of perfectly controlled violence. Watched a 4-star general realize too late that he'd chosen the wrong target for his intimidation tactics. "She's not a private," he said to the empty office. "She's a Tier 1 operator hiding in plain sight, and General Blackwood just found out the hardest way possible." He began preparing his travel documents. This investigation required immediate attention and personal oversight. By 0600 hours, he was on a military flight to California. By the time he arrived at Crimson Ridge Academy, the incident was already spreading through military social media networks. Footage from Hayes' phone had leaked somehow, despite the phone confiscation order. Compressed video, low resolution, but clear enough to show the essential elements. General strikes private. Private defends herself with techniques that absolutely do not match her official capabilities. General ends up on the floor begging for mercy. The reactions were splitting along predictable lines. Traditional military community outraged that a private had struck a general regardless of justification. Younger generation pointing out that assault is assault, regardless of rank. Veterans with combat experience watching the footage and recognizing professional operator-level technique. And in secure chat rooms used by special operations personnel, a different conversation was happening. People with the right clearances and the right experience were watching that footage and recognizing the techniques. Filipino Kali joint manipulation, Israeli Krav Maga disarming sequences, blood choke application that was straight out of Tier 1 training manuals. Someone dropped Kira's name in one of those chat rooms. Within an hour, people who'd served with Task Force Sentinel were confirming that, yes, that was Staff Sergeant Ashford. Yes, she was one of theirs. Yes, she was exactly as dangerous as the video suggested. The story was out. The question now It was how the military would respond to the revelation that one of their most capable operators had been hiding at a training academy while a general tried to break her for being weak. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan arrived at Crimson Ridge at 1400 hours, 32 hours after the incident. He carried a classified tablet and wore the expression of someone who knew this investigation was going to rewrite careers and potentially change military policy. His first meeting was with Colonel Thatcher and Master Sergeant Rourke. Secure conference room doors, locked phones confiscated. "Gentlemen," Callahan said, pulling up files on his tablet, "we need to talk about who you've really been training for the past 3 months." He turned the tablet to face them. Kira's classified service record filled the screen. Thatcher's face went pale as he read. Rourke's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd suspected most of this already. "Task Force Sentinel," "No, yeah," Callahan said. "Tier 1 asset, some of the most classified operations conducted in the last 5 years. This woman has capabilities that most operators never develop. And according to your reports, she's been deliberately failing every evaluation for 95 days. Why, Thatcher asked. Why would someone with this background choose to appear incompetent? Coast Province. Callahan pulled up the after-action report, though most of it was redacted even at his clearance level. Something happened there that broke her. Medical files indicate severe PTSD survivors' guilt, moral injury from the violence she had to employ. She requested the most anonymous assignment possible. Somewhere she could fade into the background and process what she'd experienced. Rourke spoke for the first time. She was healing, learning how to be something other than a weapon. And Blackwood targeted her because he saw weakness. He saw exactly what she wanted him to see, Callahan corrected. The problem is when he escalated to physical assault, she had to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting herself. She chose protection, and in doing so revealed capabilities that are now going to require explanation. What happens to her? Thatcher asked. That depends on what happens in the next 48 hours. There's going to be a formal hearing. Blackwood wants charges filed, but once her background comes out, this becomes a question of whether the military is going to prosecute one of its most decorated operators for defending herself against assault from a superior officer. Callahan stood gathering his materials. I need to interview her, and I need to see all the security footage, all the witness statements, everything you have, because this isn't just about one incident anymore. This is about what we're willing to do to the people who do the hardest jobs in the darkest places. He paused at the door. And gentlemen, between you and me, I've reviewed that footage a dozen times. What she did to General Blackwood demonstrated more restraint and discipline than most operators show in their entire careers. She had 6 ways to kill him in those 5 seconds. She chose the one option that left him alive and uninjured. That's not excessive force, that's professional excellence under pressure. So she'll be cleared, Thatcher asked. If I have anything to say about it, she'll be reinstated to her proper rank and given a formal apology. But politics being what they are, I can't make promises. All I can do is make sure the truth is documented and presented clearly. Callahan left to begin his investigation, leaving Thatcher and Rourke alone in the conference room. You knew, Thatcher said again. Rourke nodded. Her father was like a brother to me. I recognized the family combat style, even when she was trying to hide it. Figured she deserved privacy. Figured healing was more important than protocol. You should have reported it. Maybe, but I'm not sorry I didn't. Rourke stood, his old joints creaking. Colonel, I've spent 40 years in this military, seen a lot of things. And I'll tell you this, what General Blackwood did to that young woman was wrong. What she did to defend herself was right. Sometimes the rules need to bend for justice to be served. The rules don't bend for anyone, Sergeant. That's what makes them rules. Then maybe we need better rules, because the current ones let a general assault a private with impunity until she was forced to defend herself. And now she's the one facing consequences while he's playing the victim. Rourke moved toward the door. I'll testify on her behalf. Put it in the record. That woman showed more discipline in 5 seconds than most people show in a lifetime. And if the military can't recognize that, then we've lost something fundamental about what we're supposed to stand for. He left Thatcher alone with his thoughts and his growing certainty that this incident was going to force conversations the military had been avoiding for decades. 48 hours after the mess hall incident, the formal hearing began. The conference room had been converted into a makeshift hearing chamber. Heavy curtains covered the windows to prevent an observation from outside. Armed military police stood at both entrances. A secure video link connected the room to the Pentagon, where General William Crawford, a three-star officer and General Blackwood's direct superior, observed via encrypted transmission. The panel consisted of Colonel Brennan Thatcher as presiding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Reed Callahan as investigator, Master Sergeant Thaddeus Rourke as expert witness on combat techniques, and two additional colonels from the Judge Advocate General Corps who would provide legal oversight. General Vincent Blackwood sat at one table flanked by his legal advisor, a sharp-eyed JAG captain who'd spent the past 48 hours trying to construct a case for insubordination and assault on a superior officer. Blackwood looked diminished somehow, despite his uniform being perfectly pressed and his posture rigidly correct. The bruising on his neck had darkened to purple and yellow visible above his collar, despite his attempt to hide it. At the opposite table sat Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford, not private. Her proper rank had been reinstated for the hearing. She wore her dress uniform with all her commendations displayed. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor Device 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart 2 oak leaf clusters, Expert Marksmanship badges, Ranger Tab, Special Operations patches that most of the people in the room didn't have clearance to fully understand. The contrast was stark. Blackwood surrounded by lawyers trying to appear commanding while nursing visible injuries. Kira sitting alone, calm and professional, wearing the evidence of a career that most soldiers only dreamed about. Thatcher called the hearing to order at 0800 hours precisely. This hearing is convened to investigate the incident that occurred at Crimson Ridge Academy Mess Hall on May 18th at approximately 1815 hours. All testimony will be recorded and may be used in subsequent legal proceedings. General Crawford is observing via secure link and has authority to direct proceedings as necessary. On the screen, General Crawford nodded. He was 61 years old, a career infantry officer who'd come up through the ranks during the transition from Cold War to modern conflicts. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes showed intelligence and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that came from decades of military service. "Let's begin with the video evidence," Thatcher said. The screen switched to show footage from multiple angles. Security Camera 3 provided an overhead view of the entire mess hall. Security Camera 7 showed a side angle that captured facial expressions. And then there was the phone footage from Private Garrett Hayes confiscated but preserved as evidence, which provided the clearest view of the actual confrontation. The panel watched in silence. Blackwood's approach, the verbal assault, the slap that echoed through the silent facility, Kira's 5-word response, the second attempted strike, and then 5 seconds of violence so controlled and precise that it looked almost choreographed. When the footage ended, the room remained quiet for a long moment. "Let the record show," Thatcher said formally, "that video evidence from 4 separate sources confirms the sequence of events. General Blackwood initiated physical contact by striking Staff Sergeant Ashford. General Blackwood prepared to strike again. Staff Sergeant Ashford responded with defensive techniques that neutralized the threat in approximately 5 seconds, ceasing all defensive action immediately upon General Blackwood's submission. He turned to the witness table. "We'll now hear testimony. Private Hayes, please take the stand." Garrett Hayes looked nervous as he moved to the witness chair. 24 years old, barely out of initial training, suddenly thrust into a situation with career-ending implications for multiple senior officers. Private Hayes de Callahan began the questioning. "Please describe in your own words what you observed on the evening of May 18th. Hayes cleared his throat. "I was seated approximately 20 feet from Staff Sergeant Ashford when General Blackwood approached her table. I heard him order her to stand. Then he began criticizing her loudly about the spilled juice. Did this seem unusual to you?" "Yes, sir. It seemed excessive for such a minor accident. The general's voice was getting louder, and his body language seemed aggressive. That's when I started recording on my phone. I know it was against regulations, but something felt wrong about the situation." "Continue." "The general kept moving closer to Staff Sergeant Ashford. He was using his size to intimidate her, standing right in her personal space. Then he struck her across the face. The sound was incredibly loud. Everyone in the mess hall heard it." Hayes paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was describing. "After he hit her, there was this moment where everything just stopped. And then Staff Sergeant Ashford said something. I couldn't hear exactly what, but the general's face changed. He looked furious. He reached for her like he was going to hit her again, and that's when she moved. Describe her movement. It was fast, sir. Faster than I could really follow. 1 second the general was reaching for her, the next second he was on the ground, and she had him in some kind of hold. He was tapping the floor and saying he couldn't breathe. Then she let him go immediately and called for medical assistance. Did Staff Sergeant Ashford's response seem excessive to you? Hayes considered the question carefully. No, sir. If anything, it seemed controlled. She stopped the instant he submitted. She didn't hit him or hurt him beyond what was necessary to stop the threat. If she'd wanted to seriously injure him, I think she could have. What makes you say that? The way she moved, sir. I've seen training videos of special operations personnel. She moved like that, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Callahan nodded. Thank you, Private Hayes. You may step down. The next hour consisted of testimony from other witnesses. Kitchen staff who'd observed Blackwood deliberately position himself near Kira's table. Training instructors who described 3 days of progressive harassment targeting Kira specifically. Medical Staff Sergeant Sienna Vale who testified that Blackwood's injuries were consistent with controlled restraint rather than excessive force. Each piece of testimony built a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. A general had targeted a struggling recruit for systematic humiliation. The recruit had endured until the harassment escalated to physical assault. Then the recruit had defended herself with professional-level competence that revealed she wasn't struggling at all. When Master Sergeant Rourke took the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted. 40 years of service commanded respect even from the colonels on the panel. Master Sergeant Rourke, Callahan said, "You've been asked to provide expert testimony on the combat techniques employed by Staff Sergeant Ashford. Can you walk us through what you observed?" Rourke leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "I've trained close-quarters combat for 40 years across 6 conflicts. I've worked with Rangers, Special Forces, Delta, Operators, SEALs, and specialized units I can't name in this forum. What Staff Sergeant Ashford executed was textbook Tier 1 operator protocol. He used a laser pointer to indicate movements on the frozen video footage. This initial rotation, that's Filipino Kali. You can see how she uses his momentum against him, classic redirection principle. Here where she controls his wrist, that's pressure point manipulation taught in Israeli Krav Maga. The nerve clusters she's targeting require precise knowledge of anatomy. Continue. The hip throw is judo-based but modified for combat application rather than sport. Notice how she accelerates his descent instead of cushioning it. That's deliberate. She's ensuring he hits the ground hard enough to eliminate any remaining threat response. Rourke advanced to the next frame. And this is what tells me she's had extensive specialized training. The blood choke she applies is precise. 11 to 13 pounds of protein on the carotid artery exact angle to restrict blood flow without crushing the trachea. At this perimeter, he has 7 to 10 seconds before unconsciousness. She releases him after 5 seconds when he submits. In your expert opinion, was the force she employed appropriate? More than appropriate, sir. It was exemplary. She had minimum 6 kill options available in those 5 seconds. She could have crushed his trachea, dislocated his shoulder-struck vulnerable targets like the throat or temple. She chose the one technique that gave her complete control while inflicting minimal injury. That's not excessive force. That's professional restraint under pressure. One of the JAG colonels leaned forward. Master Sergeant, you're suggesting that Staff Sergeant Ashford deliberately held back. I'm not suggesting it, sir. I'm stating it in fact. Watch the footage again. Every movement is controlled. Every application of force is measured. She's not fighting out of fear or anger. She's executing a tactical problem with the same precision a surgeon uses in an operating room. How does a recruit develop these capabilities? She doesn't, sir. An operator with years of specialized training does. And that's what Staff Sergeant Ashford is, as her service record clearly demonstrates. Callahan introduced Kira's classified file into evidence. Even with most operational details redacted, the summary was impressive. The panel members read in silence, their expressions shifting from curiosity to surprise to something approaching disbelief. 52 enemy killed in 18 minutes, one of the colonels said quietly. 14 hostages recovered. Jesus Christ. Thatcher cleared his throat. The question before this panel is not whether Staff Sergeant Ashford is capable of violence. Her record makes that clear. The question is whether her response to General Blackwood's assault constituted appropriate self-defense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Before we address that General Crawford's voice came through the video link, I want to hear from General Blackwood. General, you've been sitting there for 90 minutes listening to testimony about how you assaulted a subordinate. Do you have anything to say? Blackwood's JAG advisor leaned over to whisper urgently, but Blackwood waved him off. He stood slowly, his movements stiff from the lingering effects of the takedown. General Crawford, panel members, I request permission to make a statement. Granted. Blackwood took a breath. Everything in the testimony you have heard is accurate. I struck Staff Sergeant Ashford without justification. When she defended herself, I prepared to strike her again. What happened next was entirely my fault and my responsibility. His advisor looked horrified, but Blackwood continued. For the past 4 years since my son's death in Afghanistan, I've been on a crusade. I convinced myself that lowered standards killed him, that allowing people to serve who I deemed unworthy had somehow caused his death. I've used that grief as justification for behavior that I now recognize as abuse of power. He looked directly at Kira for the first time since the hearing began. Staff Sergeant Ashford was not my first target. Over 30 years of service, I've used physical intimidation 14 times that I can document. 9 women, 5 men who I considered weak or insufficient. None of them reported me because I held their careers in my hands. General, his advisor tried to interrupt, but Blackwood shook his head. I need to say this. Staff Sergeant Ashford was different because she could defend herself. And in those 5 seconds on that mess hall floor, unable to breathe, completely helpless, I experienced what every person I've abused experienced. Terror, humiliation, the knowledge that someone more powerful was choosing whether to hurt you. He paused, his voice dropping. The remarkable thing is that she chose not to. She had me completely at her mercy, and she released me immediately when I submitted. That's discipline. That's what I should have been teaching all these years instead of breaking people through fear. The room was absolutely silent. My father was a general, Blackwood continued. He beat discipline into me from age 6, called it building character, preparing me for military life. I spent 30 years swearing I'd never be like him. Then I became exactly him. The cycle of abuse perpetuated through everything I did. He turned to address the panel directly. I request court-martial not just for striking Staff Sergeant Ashford, but for the 30-year pattern of abuse that preceded it. I don't deserve leniency. I don't deserve this uniform. I need to face the consequences of my actions so that maybe finally I can break the cycle that my father started. His JAG advisor looked like he wanted to die. Blackwood had just confessed to decades of criminal conduct in a recorded hearing. There was no walking this back. General Crawford's voice came through the speaker, measured and thoughtful. General Blackwood, your candor is noted. However, this hearing is specifically about the incident with Staff Sergeant Ashford. We'll address your other admissions through separate proceedings. Understood, sir. Sit down, General. Staff Sergeant Ashford, please take the stand. Kira moved to the witness chair with the same controlled precision she demonstrated throughout the hearing. Her posture was correct, but not rigid. Her expression was calm, but not emotionless. She looked like exactly what she was, a professional soldier, ready to provide accurate testimony. State your full name and rank for the record, Callahan instructed. Staff Sergeant Kira Marie Ashford, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, currently attached to Task Force Sentinel. Staff Sergeant, let's start with why you were at Crimson Ridge Academy performing as a struggling recruit. Kira took a breath. After the Coast Province operation on February 14th this year, I was offered 2 pieces of paper. One was paperwork for the Medal of Honor. The other was recommendation for psychiatric discharge. I was told I exceeded mission parameters, that my actions saved 14 lives, but demonstrated psychological issues requiring evaluation. What were those psychological issues? I killed 52 men in 18 minutes and felt nothing while doing it. That absence of feeling terrified me more than the violence itself. I started having nightmares. Flashbacks. I couldn't be around diesel fuel without smelling the burning compound. Loud noises made me reach for weapons that weren't there. I was having symptoms of severe PTSD and moral injury. Her voice remained steady, clinical, but there was pain underneath the professional delivery. I requested the most anonymous assignment possible, somewhere I could fade into the background and figure out how to be human again instead of just a weapon. Crimson Ridge seemed perfect, a training facility where I could play the struggling recruit and no one would look too closely. Why deliberately fail evaluations? Because excellence draws attention. If I'd performed at my actual capability level, people would ask questions. They'd investigate my background. I needed to be invisible, unremarkable, the worst recruit in the academy so nobody would wonder who I really was. For 95 days, you maintained this performance. Yes, sir. Every missed shot, every failed drill, every moment of apparent confusion was calculated. It was the hardest acting I've ever done, harder than the actual combat operations. Callahan pulled up her training scores. These marksmanship results show you missing targets at 50 meters. What's your actual effective range? 800 meters with standard M4 platform, 1,200 meters with designated marksman rifle. I've made confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The panel members exchanged glances. The contrast between her official scores and her actual capabilities was staggering. Let's talk about General Blackwood. When did you first become aware of his harassment? Day 94 when he arrived for the inspection tour. Master Sergeant Rourke warned me that General Blackwood had a reputation for targeting recruits he considered weak. By the next morning, it was clear I was his primary target. Did you consider reporting the harassment? No, sir. Reporting would trigger an investigation. Investigation would reveal my background. I just wanted to keep my head down until the inspection ended. Walk us through what happened in the mess hall. Kira's voice remained steady as she recounted the events. The spilled juice, Blackwood's approach, the verbal assault that crescendoed into physical violence. When he struck you the first time, what went through your mind? Threat assessment, height, weight, stance, breathing pattern, eye dilation, automatic analysis that 4 years with Sentinel trained me to do without conscious thought. I calculated that he was preparing to escalate further. How did you know? Body language. His adrenaline was elevated, pupils dilated, breathing rapid. His shoulders were squared for additional strikes. His fist was clenched. He wasn't going to stop with one hit. This was escalating into sustained assault. And your response? I defended myself using minimum necessary force to neutralize the threat. Joint manipulation to control his arms, hip throw to bring him to the ground, blood choke to establish submission. I monitored his response continuously and released him immediately when he submitted. You could have injured him more severely. Yes, sir. I had multiple options available. I could have dislocated his shoulder, crushed his trachea, struck vulnerable targets. I chose the technique that gave me control while minimizing permanent damage. Why? For the first time, emotion flickered across Kira's face. Because I'm trying not to be the person who defaults to maximum violence. I came to Crimson Ridge to learn how to be something other than a weapon. Permanently injuring General Blackwood would have meant I failed at that goal. Callahan paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Staff Sergeant, I want to ask you about Coast Province. The panel has access to the classified summary, but can you tell us in your own words what happened? Kira's hands tightened on the armrest of the chair, the only visible sign of distress. Intelligence said 15 to 20 hostiles, light weapons, minimal fortifications. Reality was 52 Taliban fighters, heavy weapons, and the compound rigged with IEDs. My team was pinned down outside. I was inside with 14 civilians, including 6 children. You were ordered to abort the mission. Yes, sir, I refused. I made the tactical decision that I could complete the extraction if I moved immediately, but only if I operated alone and engaged with maximum aggression. 18 minutes? 18 minutes from first shot to final extraction, 210 rounds of ammunition, 52 confirmed kills. I used rifles, captured enemy weapons, and hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran low. Her voice was flat, delivering facts without emotion. I carried the last child out as the compound exploded behind us. The blast destroyed $12 million in communications equipment and injured 3 of my teammates. The after-action report says you saved 14 lives. I saved 14 lives by killing 52 people with mechanical efficiency. One of those kills happened directly in front of a 6-year-old girl who will remember my face for the rest of her life. Now the emotion broke through. I did what was necessary. I'd do it again if faced with the same choice. But it cost me something. Changed me into someone I didn't recognize. The room was silent. Several panel members looked uncomfortable, confronted with the reality of what they asked their elite operators to do in classified missions that would never be publicly acknowledged. General Crawford's voice came through the speaker, gentle now. Staff Sergeant, after the mission, you were recommended for both Medal of Honor and psychiatric discharge. Why was discharge considered? The psychological evaluation stated that I'd become excessively effective at violence, that I'd crossed from soldier into something that made the evaluators uncomfortable. They were concerned I'd lost the ability to distinguish between necessary force and excessive force. But in the mess hall, you demonstrated precise control. You used exactly the force necessary and no more. Imrua. Yes, sir, because I've spent 95 days learning to control that capability. Learning to be the person who chooses when to use violence rather than the person who defaults to it. General Blackwood was a test I didn't want to take, but I passed it. I protected myself without becoming the thing I'm trying to move beyond. Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. You may step down. As Kira returned to her seat, Callahan introduced the final piece of evidence, a classified file folder that he handled with obvious reverence. General Crawford, panel members, I've been authorized to share something that Staff Sergeant Ashford didn't know existed. These are letters from the families she rescued in Coast Province. He opened the folder and began distributing copies to the panel. 14 letters translated from Dari and Pashto, all expressing gratitude, all acknowledging the violence she had to employ to save them, and all asking that she be forgiven for the burden she carried on their behalf. He selected one letter and read aloud. This is from the mother of Amara, the 6-year-old girl Staff Sergeant Ashford mentioned. Dear soldier lady, my daughter has nightmares about the terrible day you saved us. But every night before she sleeps, she prays to Allah that your nightmares will stop. She says you were scary but brave. She says you look sad even while you were protecting us. She wants you to know that we are alive because of you, that our family is together because of your courage. She drew you a picture. It shows an angel covered in battle armor with wings made of fire. That is how she sees you. Not as a monster, but as a guardian who paid a terrible price to keep us safe. Please forgive yourself the way we forgive you. You gave us the gift of life. We pray you find peace. Kira's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face silently as Callahan continued reading. Amara wants to be strong like you when she grows up. Not because you can fight, but because you chose to save children even when it hurt you to do it. Thank you for being brave enough to become what we needed. Thank you for caring enough that it cost you something. We will remember you in our prayers every day for the rest of our lives. The hearing room was silent except for Kira's quiet crying. Even Blackwood looked shaken, confronted with the reality of what his target had endured. General Crawford cleared his throat. This panel will deliberate and issue findings. All parties are dismissed until we reconvene at 1400 hours. The recess lasted 3 hours. Kira spent it alone in a holding room processing the letters she'd never known existed. Master Sergeant Rourke brought her coffee and sat with her in silence, providing the steady presence of someone who understood combat trauma. They're good people, Kira said finally. They didn't deserve what they witnessed. Neither did you, Rourke replied. You saved them. That matters. I became a monster to save them. No, you became what was necessary. There's a difference, and monsters enjoy the violence. You endured it. At 1400 hours precisely, the panel reconvened. Everyone returned to their positions. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Colonel Thatcher stood to deliver the findings. This panel has reviewed all evidence and testimony regarding the incident of May 18th. We find as follows. He read from the official document. General Vincent Blackwood's actions constituted assault of a subordinate under UCMJ Article 128. His admitted pattern of similar conduct over 30 years constitutes conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133. Recommendation: immediate retirement at reduced rank of Major General, forfeiture of certain veteran benefits, formal reprimand and permanent record. General Blackwood will face separate court-martial for additional admitted offenses. Blackwood stood and saluted the panel. I accept these findings without appeal. Thank you for holding me accountable. Thatcher continued. Regarding Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford, her actions constitute lawful self-defense under UCMJ, Article 916, use of force deemed appropriate and proportional to threat faced. The staff sergeant demonstrated exceptional restraint utilizing minimum force necessary and ceasing all defensive action immediately upon threat neutralization. He looked directly at Kira. No charges are warranted. Full reinstatement to staff sergeant rank, effective immediately, with back pay for the 3 months served at reduced rank. Staff Sergeant Ashford is hereby offered 3 assignment options: return to Task Force Sentinel with full operational status, honorable discharge with full benefits and classified service recognition, or assignment to Crimson Ridge Training Command to develop and teach curriculum in self-defense adaptive combat techniques and PTSD management. General Crawford's voice came through the speaker. Staff Sergeant Ashford, the choice is yours. The military failed you by allowing you to be placed in a situation where you were harassed and assaulted. We can't undo that, but we can offer you the opportunity to define your next chapter of service. Kira stood slowly. She looked at Rourke, who nodded encouragement. She looked at the panel members who'd listened to her story with respect. She looked at Blackwood, who met her eyes with something that might have been gratitude for the restraint she'd shown. Sir, I choose option 3, Training Command. I want to teach the next generation how to protect themselves without becoming what I became. And maybe in teaching them, I'll finish learning the lesson myself. Crawford smiled. Staff Sergeant Ashford, welcome to Training Command. Use your experience to make us better. Make sure no other operator has to hide who they are because they're afraid of being broken by the system they serve. Dismissed. The hearing concluded. As people filed out, General Blackwood approached Kira. They faced each other, the general who'd been broken and the operator who'd broken him with measured precision. Staff Sergeant, he said quietly, I owe you more than an apology. You showed me what discipline really means. Restraint, control, choosing not to use your full capability even when you have every justification. General, your son didn't die because of lowered standards. He died because he was brave enough to serve in a profession where death is an occupational hazard. That's a legacy worth honoring. I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to undo the damage I've caused, maybe counsel veterans, work with military families, something useful. Breaking cycles is the hardest mission there is, sir, but it's worth fighting for. They shook hands, not as enemies, not exactly as friends, but as two people who'd both learned painful lessons about strength and violence and the importance of knowing when to use each. 6 months later, on a cold November morning, Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford stood in front of her first class at Crimson Ridge Academy. 40 students, mixed ranks and backgrounds, all required to complete her course in adaptive self-defense and crisis management. The curriculum she developed covered threat assessment, appropriate force continuum, de-escalation techniques, legal and ethical frameworks for self-defense, and physical techniques drawn from her years of training. But more than that, it covered something the military had historically ignored: how to recognize when you were becoming a weapon instead of a warrior, and how to choose humanity over capability. Welcome to Advanced Combat Training, she began. I'm going to teach you how to protect yourselves and others effectively. But more importantly, I'm going to teach you how to live with the capabilities you develop. Because the hardest part of being good at violence isn't learning how to do it. It's learning when not to. In the back of the room, Master Sergeant Rourke sat as a guest observer. 62 years old, 40 years of service, preparing for retirement, but wanting to see Kira's first class. A female recruit raised her hand. Ma'am, the other instructors say you took down a 4-star general in 5 seconds. Is that true? Kira paused, considering how to answer. What's true is that I was placed in a situation where I had to defend myself against someone who should have known better. What's also true is that I had the capability to permanently injure or kill him, and I chose not to. That choice, that restraint, is what I'm here to teach you. So size and rank don't matter in a fight. They matter, but they don't determine outcome. Discipline determines outcome. Training determines outcome. And most importantly, your willingness to use only the force necessary determines whether you're a professional or just someone who knows how to hurt people. She moved through the classroom, making eye contact with each student. I've killed 52 people in combat. I have nightmares about every single one. Not because I regret protecting the people who needed protection, but because taking life costs something. It should cost something. The day it stops costing you something is the day you've lost your humanity. A male recruit in the front row spoke up. How do you deal with that cost, ma'am? Honestly, I'm still learning. That's why I'm teaching instead of operating. I'm here to figure out how to be someone who has these capabilities but doesn't define herself by them. How to be strong enough to fight but wise enough to walk away when fighting isn't necessary. She pulled up a presentation on the screen. Over the next 12 weeks, you're going to learn techniques that could permanently disable or kill another human being. You're going to develop capabilities that most people never have. My job is to make sure you also develop the judgment to use those capabilities appropriately. The class ran for 2 hours. Kira demonstrated techniques, corrected form, answered questions with the patience of someone who'd found her calling. When it ended, a shy recruit approached her nervously. Ma'am, I'm Private Lisa Dawson. I wanted to thank you for this course. I've been worried that I'm not tough enough for military service. Kira studied the young woman, 22 years old, small frame, uncertain posture. She saw herself 6 months ago, though, for different reasons. Private Dawson, what's your definition of toughness? Being able to take a hit, I guess, being strong. Wrong. Toughness is being able to endure pain and still choose mercy over revenge. Toughness is having the capability to hurt someone and choosing not to. Toughness is facing your fears every single day and still showing up. Kira put a hand on the recruit's shoulder. You're tougher than you think, and over the next 12 weeks, I'm going to prove it to you. After the class cleared out, Rourke approached. Good start, kid. Your father would be proud. I wish he could see this. He can, in his own way. Rourke handed her an envelope. This came for you. Official mail. Kira opened it and found a letter on Task Force Sentinel letterhead. She read it quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to something more complex. They want me to consult, she said. There's a hostage situation, similar parameters to Coast. They want me to train the team, plan the operation, but not execute. They need someone who can teach them how to save everyone without becoming what I had to become. You going to do it? I think so, not because I want to go back to operations, but because maybe I can help them learn from my mistakes. Help them complete the mission without carrying the weight I carried. That's growth, Kira, using your experience to build up instead of tear down. A familiar figure stood waiting outside the classroom as students filed out. Vincent Blackwood, dressed in civilian clothes for the first time Kira had seen him. No uniform, no stars, no authority, just a man trying to rebuild. Staff Sergeant, he said, then corrected himself. Kira, I hope it's okay that I came. General Vincent, what brings you here? He held up a folder. I've been working with the VA, counseling officers who've used their rank to intimidate subordinates, helping them recognize the patterns before they destroy careers the way I did. He opened the folder to show testimonials. 43 officers in 6 months. It's not enough to undo 30 years, but it's a start. Kira took the folder, read a few lines. You're actually doing it, breaking the cycle. Trying. Some days are harder than others. But I remember those 5 seconds every time I want to fall back into old patterns. Remember what it felt like to be helpless. He paused. I also wanted to thank you for not killing me when you could have. I was trying not to be a weapon anymore. You succeeded and you taught me that I'd been using my rank as a weapon for 30 years. That was the lesson worth learning even if it hurt. After he left, Rourke shook his head admiringly. Never thought I'd see the day. Man's actually walking the walk. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, Kira said. Even generals who make mistakes. Private Garrett Hayes appeared in the doorway, now wearing corporal stripes. Ma'am, your afternoon class is ready. Also, the footage from that night, the Pentagon finally cleared a sanitized version for training use. They want it in the curriculum on appropriate force under extreme stress. Your 5 seconds are going to be studied for decades. Great, Kira said dryly, immortalized as the sergeant who took down a general. No, ma'am, Hayes corrected. Immortalized as the operator who showed perfect restraint when she had every reason not to. That's the part everyone remembers. Her encrypted phone rang. She answered, listened, nodded. Send me the complete brief. I'll design a training package and run your team through scenarios. But I'm not going back in the field. My fighting days are teaching days now. She ended the call and looked out at the Pacific Ocean visible through the classroom windows. The same ocean that had provided soundtrack to her 95 days of hiding. The same waves that had crashed while she pretended to be weak so she could heal from being too strong. You know what's strange, she said to Rourke. I spent 95 days learning to be weak. Took 5 seconds of defending myself to remember I never was. But the real lesson came after. Learning that being strong doesn't mean always using your strength. It means knowing when to hold back. That's wisdom, kid. Hard-earned, but wisdom nonetheless. General Blackwood learned it too. Different lesson, same conclusion. Control matters more than capability. She gathered her teaching materials, preparing for the afternoon session. As she moved toward the door, she paused and looked back at the classroom. This was her compound now, not filled with hostiles and civilians hiding in terror, but with students learning to be warriors who chose when to fight. This was her 18 minutes stretched out over 12-week increments, teaching the next generation that the most dangerous person in any room was the one who knew when to walk away. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. Amara here. I am 17 now. I study to be doctor. I help people like you helped us. Thank you for teaching me that strength means protecting others even when it costs you everything. You are still in my prayers. Kira saved the message and walked out into the California sunshine, ready for whatever came next, knowing that she'd finally found the balance between weapon and warrior, between capability and humanity. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't running. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, teaching others the lesson she'd learned the hardest way possible, that the greatest weapon wasn't violence, but the wisdom to choose when violence was truly necessary. And in those choices, made every day by every soldier she taught, was the redemption she'd been seeking since Coast Province. Not in forgetting what she'd done, but in ensuring that future operators learned to carry the burden with more grace than she had. The past couldn't be changed. 52 lives couldn't be returned. But the future could be shaped one student at a time, one lesson in restraint at a time, one moment of choosing humanity over capability at a time. That was the mission now. And unlike Coast Province, this was a mission with no end date, no extraction timeline, no moment where success was measured in bodies and rescued civilians. This mission was measured in warriors who learned to be more than weapons. In operators who understood that true strength was choosing not to fight. In the next generation, carrying forward the hard lessons so they didn't have to learn them the way she did. Staff Sergeant Kira Ashford, Task Force Sentinel operator turned instructor, walked across the Crimson Ridge Academy grounds, with the autumn sun warming her face and the sound of the Pacific Ocean reminding her that some forces were eternal and unchanging while others could be shaped and guided toward better purposes. She'd been broken in Coast. She'd hidden at Crimson Ridge. She'd been exposed in 5 seconds of necessary violence. And now finally she was healing. Not by forgetting, but by transforming her pain into purpose, her trauma into teaching, her experience into wisdom that would protect others from having to walk the same dark road she'd traveled. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she arrived here 6 months ago, pretending to be the weakest soldier in the academy. But it was the ending she deserved, the one she'd earned through restraint as much as through capability. The one that proved that even weapons could choose to become something more. The general had learned that lesson in 5 seconds on a mess hall floor. Kira was still learning it every day, with every student, with every choice to teach rather than destroy. And in that learning and that teaching and that choice was the answer to the question she'd been asking since Coast Province. Who was she when she wasn't defined by her capability for violence? She was a warrior who knew when to fight and when to teach others to walk away. She was a weapon who'd learned to forge other weapons with the wisdom to stay sheathed. She was Kira Ashford, and she'd finally found her way home.